Now we'll move on to Steve, who is the Senior Program Manager at the Pacific Northwest Economic Region. Thank you, Steve, for joining us. I really appreciate you taking time to be part of this workshop. And if you would just tell us a little bit about yourself and we'll get going.
Sure. No, thanks, Marion. Can everybody hear me all right? All right, that ahead sounds good. Anyway, yeah, so to kind of give you guys a little bit of background about our organization, it was great to hear coming in at the end where Rob was mentioned just regional collaboration that goes on in this area of the country and both countries. So the Pacific Northwest Economic Region is it's a statutory entity that's our board is made up of legislators from both Western Canada and in the Northwest states. And so what I was going to do is give you guys a really quick slideshow, kind of try to set the story here for you, and then go into a little bit more on questions. Also, if you have any questions, feel free to stop me at any point. Happy to try and answer anything that might come up. So just try and catch my attention if you have a quick question. So let me see if I can share my screen with you guys. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and jump here into what PNWAR is. So as I mentioned, PNWAR is a partnership between the 5 states of the Northwest and then the 5 provinces and territories of Western Canada. And so it was established in 1991 with statutory language in the Northwest states. And each state actually passed legislation that was actually duplicate in each jurisdiction. So to think of how hard it is to pass legislation in one state, all 5 states agreed that this was something that they wanted to do together, and look at how they could partner to make the region more aware of how they can deal with challenges and issues with Western Canada, how they could improve border relations. And then also what they could do to help streamline some of the challenges we might have crossing the border. And I know Dr. Trautman's going to talk a little bit about that after I'm done with my presentation, but she'll get into more specifics there. Today I wanted to talk a little bit about the relationship that we have in our region with our partners in Alaska, Yukon, Northwest Territories, and how that relationship is formed out of what we've been doing since 1991, and go into a little bit more detail on some of the issues that we have when it comes to Arctic development and the role that subnational governments play with international and national policies. So it's a big issue that we try to advocate for. I know Rob Kerr gave his presentation, and I'm sorry I didn't get to sit in on the whole thing, but he represents the federal government of Canada, and what we try to do is advocate for what the provinces and the states see as challenges that they hope that the federal governments can help partner on. And also what we do is we'll take some of the best practices that we see at the federal level and try and get our, whether it's Canada or the United States, to try and work towards those best practices that we see. So I'll get into a little bit more detail on that when it comes to the Arctic and Arctic policy. So this geography lesson here real quick, trying to show you where the region is. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more on the northern corridor, the northern jurisdictions, the 3 at the very top during the presentation. And then just really quick, to kind of, just explain what PNWAR is a little bit more. It's a very complicated structure that we have. We're a pretty unique entity. So wanted to get into some more details about how we're structured and our leadership so that we have a little bit of a baseline on where I'm coming from. So, so for our leadership, the states they appoint a nonpartisan delegate from each state. So we'll have 2 members from the Senate and 2 members from the House, both Republican and Democrat, and they represent the state as part of PNWAR. And so typically they come from backgrounds that are related to maybe international trade, some of the committees that deal with economic development and those types of things. In Canada, as many of you are aware, it's a different political system with the parliamentary system. So the government of the day they'll appoint their delegate, and then opposition members are allowed to attend, but typically it's done on their own, and so they'll come and participate and also be part of our meetings and that type of thing. But typically the government is the representative on Penwar, and they deliver kind of their policy issues and issues that they want to see addressed within our group. We also do have a relationship with the private sector. So we have a ex officio member with our private sector board, and they provide that feedback and input that we don't get from government. And so not only do we have policy issues and policy implications, but then we also have issues that the private sector will also bring up, and our governments will look at and see if there's areas that we can collaborate on or work on or try and fix. So and then to get into more details, but out of all those delegates from the elected side, that's where our executive committee and board are made up. So our current president is a state legislator from the state of Montana, and previously our president was a MLA from Saskatchewan. So it rotates every year. We'll have a US and Canadian, and then we'll have 3 vice presidents, and then out of that vice president pool, we'll have our president installed for a year. So our organization also has a really keen focus on the economy and the environment of the region. So we look at 18 different working groups, and these they can change, they can morph into different things. I know over the years, I've been part of Penwar for almost 13 years now, and I've seen some of these change a little bit. Some of their focuses have changed, but typically, we look at all areas of the economy and how our states and provinces can work together and collaborate, and identify some of these best practices and talk through some of the challenges we have. So each staff member has 3 to 4 different portfolios that they work on. I have about 4 or 5, so it keeps us pretty busy trying to keep up on what's going on in the region when it comes to different challenges with each one of these sectors. So and then the other piece of it too is that we're really focused on these sectors because they are interconnected in many ways in our region. So in some cases, you might have, say, a mine site somewhere in the inland states and provinces, but if you're hoping to get those products to market, you can't do that without rail and ports and those types of things. And so we look at the economy throughout the whole supply chain, and also what impacts can happen across that, and how we can all work together to ensure that everyone is understanding of where these products are going, what they're doing. And so that's just one example, but there's several other issues that we deal with. And I know before I got started, I wanted to try and give a little bit of a caveat to most of the stuff I'm going to talk about, because COVID-19 has impacted pretty much everything that we've done and we are doing. And so a lot of my focus now has been on how we can get our economy restarted again, and how we can advocate to the federal government on ensuring that groups and other entities that might not be part of the current stimulus packages are getting some type of awareness or some kind of funding going forward. So that's been a lot of the work we've been doing. Also trying to do more collaboration with our states and provinces and cities. So we hold calls and webinars and a number of different things just to try and boost that communication pathway, so that if there is a best practice that's going on, say Vancouver, maybe that's something we can share with Calgary or Seattle, even Bozeman, Montana. So what we're trying to do is at least get more awareness out there of some of the challenges that are out there, but also what best practices can be implemented to help us move forward. So before everything happened, I wanted to kind of give you a sense of just the economic input or impact that the region has. So if you look at Penwar as a whole, our GDP was around 1.1 trillion, and that would be about the 14th largest country in GDP across the globe. So it's a a big economic engine for North America, and you know, we try to advocate as a regional entity because of the focus and the connections that we have here in this part of the world. And then I'm going to talk a little bit too, just about the two-way trade between the U.S. and Canada. Just so everyone's aware, you know, these numbers are just from a few years ago, but it's in many cases, Canada is the #2 trading partner, #1 trading partner with our states in the region. And so, you know, to try and keep that advocacy and that awareness level up is challenging. Everybody takes Canada for granted, the United States. You know, in Canada, not being a Canadian, I can understand that, you know, there's more of awareness of what the United States is and what it does, but in the other, you know, coming from the other side, it's unfortunate is that there's just not that awareness level. And what we try to do through our capital visits and go into our legislators that are not part of our board, you know, trying to explain that this relationship is very important. You know, in many cases, if a small business is starting out to do any kind of international trade, they'll do it with Canada first. So there's that connection. And then, you know, the big thing that we're seeing with this economic recovery that is going to need to be happening is this idea that, you know, we're going to have to get back to exporting again. And, you know, for small businesses that haven't done it before, you know, Canada is the best gateway to do that if you wanted to do more international trade and that kind of thing. So those are the big areas we try to showcase with Canada, United States in that relationship, especially in our states where it's not as apparent as we'd like it to be. So now I'm going to transition a little bit into our work that we do in the Arctic. And before I do that, I just wanted to ask, does anybody have any quick questions before I jump that way?
I have a question about the COVID-19 response, but I think I'm going to save it for the end because I think it's a little bit more in depth and it might kickstart discussion. So.
Oh, that's great. So to get to our Arctic Caucus work, so back in 2009, Northwest Territories had just kind of gone through a renaissance of economic development. They were starting their de-evolution process where a territory actually becomes more autonomous. They're not as tied to the federal government as they were in the past. So in Canada, Yukon had gone through it a few years before then. Nunavut is still considered a territory and more of a, you know, the federal government has more of a role in operating of the government and how they do their day-to-day government operations and that kind of thing. So with Northwest Territories, they had gone through started their de-evolution process and realized that they wanted to be more engaged with our region and more connected with what was going on. And so in 2009, they joined our organization, and Alaska and Yukon already being partners, you know, saw an opportunity to work collaboratively, bring them into the discussion and look at how we could share issues on best practices in economic development, infrastructure development, you know, how we can do better collaboration across the region. You know, in many cases, if you're not aware of what it means to be in the Arctic for the Northwest or for North America, it's very challenging geographically. There's a lot of challenges when it comes to disconnectivity. You know, there's no direct flights that go from Alaska to Yukon and Northwest Territories. There's roads, but they're, you know, hard to maintain and that kind of thing. So, and the other part of it too is that there is a real sense of community though, because there's many families and groups that are tied to one another, but might not necessarily, you know, have that easy accessibility to one another. And so, you know, not only just the challenges you see with geography, but then just awareness too of what's going on in Northwest Territories, Alaska, and Yukon. And so I wanted to give everybody a little bit of a taste of kind of, you know, what do those jurisdictions have and what goes on up there. And then also their connectivity to the rest of our region. So in many cases for Yukon, British Columbia is its gateway to the rest of Canada, the rest of the world. Many of their flights, you know, go through Vancouver. And so there's that connection. Similar to Northwest Territories, Edmonton is their gateway city. And so, to get to Northwest Territories, typically you go through Edmonton, and many companies that do work in those areas are kind of based in both. And so you have that connectivity between those two provinces and the northern territories like that. And so, how we showcase that to folks is important. And I think just too that, people think of them as these remote areas that, not easily accessible, and 2 flights from Seattle, you can get up to Yellowknife, and same with Whitehorse, and, the same day. It doesn't take very long to get to these places. And it's pretty amazing if you can go and visit them and see them firsthand, and just get a better awareness of what, those communities have to offer. I think it's something that I go about advocating to many people, and just being more aware of what those communities have to offer. But then also you just have a better understanding too of the people, because in many cases, you hear these things in the news or see these different stories, and you're not getting the full story, in my opinion, on what really goes on up in those areas, and what the community members see as important. And so in a lot of cases, it gets sucked into this global national debate, but then there's also a lot of things that go on in the community that need to be, fleshed out a little bit more, and there needs to be more awareness of how the community is operating and that type of thing. So what we did though with the caucus was give those provinces, or sorry, the territories, an opportunity for their government to work with Alaska to talk about what these concerns are and how they can get, the government's concerns not only to our federal governments but also to our state and province government. So it was a good way to exchange information. It still is a great way to exchange information. So not only do we work within Penmore, we have the three provinces of Canada in the Northwest, but we also do a lot of advocacy to the Canadian federal government and the U.S. federal government too. So in many cases, it's a lot easier for state legislators to meet with our federal partners when they have Canadian ministers from the provinces with them. So if you imagine, if as an American, if you typically have an issue, you take it to your local government, then you might take it to the federal government, your senator or your congress member, and say, hey, this is an issue. So for Alaska, and when it comes to the Arctic and the U.S., it's a bit of a challenge. So people see Arctic issues as an Alaska issue, and in many cases, we try to advocate that that's not the case. That the U.S. is an Arctic nation because of Alaska, and that the U.S. needs to do that investment and do that support to help our Arctic communities, but then also just have a presence in the Arctic too. For many years, Canada definitely sees itself as an Arctic nation, but the investment to sovereignty issues and supporting the Arctic in Canada has always been a bit of a sticky issue with government officials in those territories. So, part of it they're always advocating for is that there just needs to be just a better awareness that the Arctic is an important piece of our countries, both our countries' economic well-being, but then also just our national identity as well. And then I was going to get into a little bit of detail too about all the jurisdictions when it comes to the economy. There's definitely been an economic downturn in the state of Alaska for the last few years. This year was projected to actually move out of their recession for the state, but more than likely because of COVID-19, that's not going to happen. So those numbers they have for 2019 are, they were about, pretty low as far as moving towards employment. But those things are going to change now. Just recently, you've heard many stories that there's going to be a lot of impacts, not only to the cruise industry, but just tourism in general when it comes to the state. So there's going to be definitely challenges there, but then also a lot of the economic development or employment development was actually based on construction, and that is going to be reduced quite a bit. So also just kind of get a better awareness too on the state and where a lot of their operating funds come from. It's really from the oil and gas. industry. And so as we've seen in the last few weeks, the oil and gas industry has taken a huge economic hit. And so with the reduced value and the cost of oil, that impacts the operating budget for the state. The state's been tied to oil and gas pretty much since the 70s with the Alaska pipeline, and so the investment that they've made off that that natural resource they put into the Alaska Permanent Fund, which been a great thing for the state. They've been able to establish about $60 billion in savings, and then out of that savings account, they provide a dividend to the citizens of the state. And so in recent years, there's been a lot of just challenges they've had with how they do not only fund the state government, but also how they do dividends to the Alaska citizens. And so out of that, there's been a lot of discussions just on how you do more economic diversification, because if you're solely devoted to one aspect of the economy, you're going to have real challenges, especially in areas like oil and gas and mining, where you can have one good year and then the next year have a really bad year. So there's just so much fluctuation and variability in those markets that it can be really challenging. And part of the idea with the Alaska Permanent Fund, though, was to have that money to save and then eventually be able to leverage that for economic diversification for a rainy day. And the more and more that these challenges that hit the state are coming, because not only was this COVID-19 going to be a big problem for the state, but even before then there was challenges in this market. And so they've been forced to really think about how they do things with innovation, how they change some of their funding streams from oil and gas. And so that's been a real issue for our state governments to deal with. At the same time, they also were working with the federal government, which is one of the largest landholders there, and also a big component of how they do some economic development. So for instance, there's quite a few military facilities in the state of Alaska, and how they leverage some of the economic potential from those facilities is important. But at the same time, they still have issues of, it's an outside entity coming in, and they're kind of in a support role. So there's some work there to be done and some economic development to gain from it. But at the same time, you're not having a sustained company that's going to be there, that's actually part of the community. And so with that, I was going to mention the Alaska Native corporations and what they've been able to do since the Native Claims Settlement Act, and how they've been able to develop that. Before I get into that, I was also going to talk a little bit about what also the federal government does when it comes to bringing resources to the state. So there's the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee that does a lot of research when it comes to more of the hard sciences. And so we've been advocating for several years that economics and social sciences are also an important piece of what we can do in Alaska to help the communities that are there. And so for several years we've been trying to advocate that, and I think we've gotten some support now from the National Science Foundation, at least to look at what we can do to at least have a better understanding of business operations in Alaska and what that means for communities and having a healthy community and sustainable community.
Steve, I have a quick question.
Sure.
So can you speak a little bit to the significance of Alaska and the Canadian Arctic to our specific region, to British Columbia and to Washington, and why it's something that your organization considers important for our citizens to think about and to advocate for?
Yeah, no, definitely. The perfect example is, Seattle is a gateway city for the state of Alaska. In many cases, Vancouver is as well. So those connections to our jurisdictions in the South. So say, many tug and barge companies that deliver goods and services to Northwest Territories and Yukon actually are based in Vancouver, and they'll transit all the way through Alaskan waters, through the Northwest Passage, and then over to northern Canada. And then for Seattle, you know, with the connections, just not only with the fishing industry, but also the cruise ship industry, anything that's being developed or shipped to Alaska comes through Tacoma or Seattle. And so those are, you know, real big connections that we have. I kind of alluded a little bit to, as well as just the air connections between Edmonton and Northwest Territories, as well as Vancouver and Yukon. And so there's so many different gateways and connections that are integrated into our region, that for Alaska, Yukon, and Northwest Territories to succeed, they have to be connected to our states and provinces. But at the same time, our states and provinces, you know, don't succeed unless there's a good connection there. So, you know, there's a huge fishing fleet here in Seattle, which you know, brings in a fair amount of revenue for the state. And, you know, without that, you know, there'd be a lot of infrastructure along the ship canal and everywhere else around Ballard and those places that wouldn't be here without Alaska. And so, you know, there's that there's a good understanding of that in some circles in the community in Seattle, but in many cases, it's just not something that's there. It's kind of taken for granted. And then, you know, there's just a lack of awareness, I think, and we've been part of different economic studies that have been done. So the McDowell Group actually did a study, I believe it was about 3 years ago, just on the connections between Seattle and Alaska. And we try to advocate for more of those types of programs that, you know, at least show that there's this interconnected nature, and it's important for our communities just to understand, you know, what's going on in each. And then to jump into the Alaska Native corporations, you know, a lot of people just aren't aware of these entities in Alaska and what they are. They are their own separate corporations that were created as a result of the Claims Act in 1971. And what they did was they established these these companies that were spread across the state of Alaska. So there were 13 originally, and there's 12 in existence today. And each one, you know, operates as a corporation. They might have several sub or companies that are part of their corporation that do different jobs and roles around the U.S. and even internationally in some cases. So some are owned by, they own construction companies, real estate companies. There's a lot of different, when they talk about economic diversification, so there's a lot of different companies that they own and operate that help the Native corporations continue to exist. And so they've been able to exist mainly because they do run, you know, good business practices, but then also they have a good opportunity to partner with our federal government to do different jobs for the government, and then also eligible to get a Native American and First Nation owned company incentives and that type of thing to get the contracts and that kind of thing. One thing we've been advocating for, and we've had groups with our economic development, just with First Nations and Native American groups, is not only how do you make companies more competitive in the U.S. and Canada, but then also how do you do it globally. So we've had a number of different speakers from First Nation and Native American groups come in and talk about these types of things, and just how they can work with the governments as well, better to understand what's going on. And so this was just basically a breakdown of the revenue from the last few years ago, I think it was, on what these companies do and what they've been able to accomplish. So the one I wanted to highlight, which is a really good story, is the Nana Regional Corporation. They actually work with a mining company from Canada called Teck. They have what they'll call the Red Dog Mine, where the private company came in and partnered with a Native corporation. And there's a lot of collaboration when it comes to workforce training, you know, doing more work on making the community more sustainable, and that kind of thing. So there is a really good best practice there when it came to how you do partnerships and how you do sharing resources and revenue and that kind of thing when there's any kind of natural resource development that's going on. And I was going to jump over to Northwest Territories really fast. So the economy in Northwest Territories is really tied to the mining industry and diamond mining in particular. Tourism is also a big piece of their economy. They've been able to generate a lot of interest from Asian and European markets to actually get tourists to come in. They do direct flights in some cases to those destinations. So it's pretty amazing to see, 747s fly in, a couple times a week to Whitehorse from Frankfurt, to bring in German tourists and European tourists. So there's been a big investment in that for the region. So in the summertime, there's a lot of opportunities for hiking and camping and that kind of thing. And then in the wintertime, the Aurora Village is a big piece of what they have to offer there as far as economic development. And then Yukon, it's pretty much the same. I know, I was going to show you guys the photo there of the hot springs. So it's actually a pretty fun place to visit if you have a chance. But anyway, Yukon's economy is pretty similar to Northwest Territories. They're a little different in the fact that they have to partner a lot with Alaska. So Carcross is that photo on the bottom there I wanted to show everyone. And that community has actually been able to work with their native corporation in the region, and they've offered up different, I don't know how to explain it, almost like kiosks or slots where Native American and First Nation groups can come in and sell products and interact with tourists that come into the region. So there's been a lot of work there. And then also Air North, which is Yukon's airline, is actually majority owner of it is a native corporation. And so there's a lot of interaction and connection between the First Nations and Yukon and their industry as well. And so I was going to kind of wrap it up here and jump into questions. Just wanted to kind of reiterate the role that we play in just, the collaboration, information sharing that we try to do. And also looking at, infrastructure development, we mentioned those connections, and part of that challenge is geography, but then also just with distances, there's also, mountain ranges and rivers and that kind of thing that make it difficult to get these communities connected. And so there's several different avenues for trying to promote these connections. And then also, our work that we do with our federal partners, just making them more aware. I know I mentioned earlier just that partnership and understanding what Canada does and the U.S. does when it comes to the Arctic. So in Canada, they've been really great about engaging with stakeholders and working with local communities on what the Arctic should be able to do, but then also how the federal government can come in and help. And so there's actually a really great collaborative spirit that's in Canada when it comes to this. The United States, it's a little different. So there's a lot more animosity and a little bit more friction when it comes to how the state and the federal government get funding, and then also just how the U.S. federal government might treat them as a state separately. So there's always this issue when it comes, and this is specifically just the U.S., that Alaska feels like it's not getting the same attention that it should from the federal government, and then in many cases the federal government's coming in and putting these authoritarian restrictions on them that they don't feel are appropriate and that they hadn't been consulted with to begin with. And so that's been something the federal government in the U.S. has been trying to do a little bit better, is do more consultation with local communities. In many cases, I think that's been the biggest challenge, is just having that conversation and going to the community and talking to the people that live there to find out. It's like, okay, well, what's the issue? How can we help? Instead, there's been in a history of just actions being done without taking anybody's thoughts into consideration. And anyway, I want to probably wrap it up there. I know I probably talked for a little too long, but wanted to open up to any questions that anybody might have, or if there's anything that I can explain a little bit better.
Steve, hi, it's Nadine, and good to, now this book has caught my attention. Fantastic. Wanted to thank you for the students who may not know. the Canadian Studies Centre has worked with Penwar for a number of years, and just fabulous partners. Steve's been involved with many of our events having to do with the Arctic. But before we open to questions, and as Marion said, love to hear from each of the students, especially I think Hannah, given your interest. But Steve, if you wouldn't mind saying something about the internships that you have available at Penwar, because we've really had a lot of success having students be in internship positions and actually then moved from the internship positions to full-time positions. And I know right now we've got one young woman who just graduated as a major in international studies from the Jackson School, and she was also one of the center's minors in Arctic studies. But if you wouldn't mind letting the students know about that, Steve, because it's really been a great partnership and set of opportunities for them.
Oh yeah, no, definitely. And I wanted to mention too, I know Sam Workington was a Corbett scholar at one point.
Mm-hmm.
So he actually interned with us a couple of years ago. And we've had several different students come through the program, and it's been really great for us. I know just recently Jennifer Grossman, she's actually at the University of Georgetown. She's getting her master's program, her master's from that program there. Mm-hmm. But she had worked with us for several years and had been part of the Jackson School. So mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I know this year it's going to be a little tougher when it comes to internships. I know we're still trying to figure what it's going to look like or how we're going to do that. Mm. But you know, in the past, it's been a great relationship. And the other thing too, I just wanted to mention, I know I didn't talk about just our university engagement within Penwar. So we do have a university presidents roundtable where we bring in university presidents from around the Northwest, and you know, have the presidents talk through some of the challenges and issues they see. So we've had Anna Marie Kelsey part of it, as well as her counterpart in Washington State and several other universities. And it's really been a great example, at least in my opinion, for collaboration. Because 10 years ago when we started doing it, we'd have the university presidents come in and say like, hey, you know, we're happy to showcase what we're doing in our own university, but you know, we really don't know what we can do as far as partnerships and that kind of thing. And then just within the last 2 years, I've actually sat in and heard presidents say, yeah, I'm really interested in how we could do, you know, transferring credits easier and how we can make, you know, more of these programs accessible to students that otherwise wouldn't be able to do them. So, you know, there has been a big jump in the last 10 years that I've seen just with how universities are being more collaborative and wanting to work, you know, not just within their own walls, but then also outside. So though that was good. Thanks, Nadine. And yeah, I was going to do the shameless plug on this book that I wrote a chapter for. So it's been a couple of years, but they just are now publishing it. So it was a good opportunity for me to talk a little bit about these issues on subnational government and put that out there. So it hasn't been published yet, but they're promising me in the next month or so.
Steve, if you don't mind, I've taken a screenshot of this that I can share with students if they are curious about the info. But if you wouldn't mind, stop sharing the screen so we can see everybody's faces again. Sure. I am curious. I have a question, kind of going back to the working groups that you showed early on in your presentation. I'm curious how your org has been affected in terms of what you're working on with the COVID-19 crisis, and what you're doing right now to kind of collaborate both across state lines and federal lines to cooperate on this crisis, given, and you talked a little bit about the kind of collaborative spirit in Canada versus the United States, which seems to be a theme throughout this workshop so far. You know, I'm curious because there are such differences in the way that our governments, state governments and federal governments approach aid and assistance. And we can see that on the federal level in terms of what our governments are doing to provide assistance to both individuals and businesses right now in the middle of this crisis. So I'm curious what Penwar is doing to work across the lines for that, since there are so many differences.
Right. Yeah, I know I don't want to take away from what Laurie's probably going to talk about, but that's probably been the biggest challenge, is how we can keep the border open, and then also how we can keep the essential goods moving across. Because early on the edict came out, it said that, it's up to the border guard to let, products in or out. And that's not really a good way to do things. It was a bit of a challenge. I think many of you saw the story about Donald Trump wanted to put military on the border. That's not what we were advocating for at all either. So those are some of the early on issues that we were seeing, that the total closure of the border and trying to militarize it. It's like, let's not go there. So that was that's something that we've been trying to advocate, and we were trying to just reach out to our connections and say, this isn't the right way to do business. And so some of that's not come to pass, and so that's been good. There's still a huge issue though with just traffic from the U.S. into Canada, and that's been a major hit as far as tourism and just the flow of people and goods and services. So that's something that we're looking out at, here in the next few weeks or so. But as far as the way states and provinces have responded, it is different, even within Canada. So Alberta and BC might be doing some things that are a little different, but in most cases though, they're trying to tackle it from a kind of a same as I would say like a lot of other states are, in general terms. I know in our region it's kind of unique. So Oregon and Washington and California have partnered together to reopen in a collaborative manner. Idaho and Montana, through our work, we've been able to actually make some things, get them to be Governor of Washington in his office a little bit more aware of what was going on in Eastern Washington. So there were some challenges there with healthcare delivery and that kind of thing. And so, they've been able to advocate there, as well as in Idaho too. There's, it's a different issue in Idaho and Montana because they just don't have the same number of cases. And so Montana just reopened and took away a lot of the restrictions they had this last weekend. But they were also in a situation where I think they had 300 cases total. And so they're looking at it as like, well, how do you justify, staying closed if we don't have the same impact that, say, Washington State has? And then in Alaska, they had a moratorium on folks coming into the state. So you had to be in quarantine for 14 days as soon as you got to the state. So you couldn't even go and work in any kind of industry. And so that had a little bit of backlash, but it seems to have made it so that the state's not as impacted from it as well. So they have less cases than Montana. Actually, Alaska and Montana are the bottom two as far as cases go. But the bigger challenge in Alaska was, how do you protect the communities that are only fly in, fly out, the remote villages and those types of places. And so there they've actually instituted total lockdown of the community. So there's delivery of goods and that kind of thing. But as far as people coming in and going, that was stopped. It's interesting because you talk about a lot of institutional knowledge and native knowledge. So the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918 actually is still something that the elders of the communities would talk about and say how that impacted them. And that history and that narrative, still resonates now today with folks. And so, that's part of the reason why they are trying to limit the amount of exposure they have. But with that, there's also challenges because there's some of the service providers that would fly to those communities. The Raven Air actually just went bankrupt. And so there's a bit of a challenge there, but there's other delivery or other companies have been able to step in and fill those roles up. But again, it's a tough issue, and we've been trying to really, what we do is bring these people together to talk through it and hear what each jurisdiction is doing. And that's one thing that we've been trying to advocate with our federal partners, is that you really need to start listening to what the states are doing or how they're going to do it collaboratively, and what the business leaders are seeing and hearing, and the stakeholders as well. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done still, and we've been working not only with our state governments or federal governments, but local governments too.
Thanks. Students, anybody have any questions? Looks like Gina maybe does.
Yeah, hi Steve, Gina here. So you mentioned earlier in your presentation how the Pacific Northwest Economic Region seeks to represent regional interests, and I'm wondering if those interests ever conflict with federal interests, and if so, how have you navigated those conflicts in interest?
Sure. Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, there's even interests that conflict with between states and provinces and territories. So there's been a number of different issues where they don't always agree when it comes to different issues. One in particular we deal with quite a bit is with like the softwood lumber agreement, for instance. That one's always been a challenge because since 1856, it's been since Canada became a country. Basically, it's been a fight between the U.S. and Canada over how they price lumber and forestry projects that cross the border. And so this is something that we advocate as far as it goes, is like, let's just make a decision. Let's agree that this is what the price should be. Why can't we move forward on this? Instead, it goes to the World Trade Organization as a fight. The state puts a tariff on it. They collect the money, and then the WTO says, okay, you don't get to do it anymore. And then they stop for a couple of years, and they just start back up again and start collecting the tariff. So it's really an odd way to do business, but they basically designed it so that they can collect this tariff for so many years until the WTO tells them no. And so we've been trying just to say, to bring more stability to the market, why not just make a decision and go with it, and then change it in a couple of years. I think with NAFTA being rewritten with the USMCA, that was a big issue of how do we bring more stability to these issues, and that's kind of where we come at it from. When there's disagreements, we try to advocate as much as we can for how we can at least come up with a solution on going forward. I think another one was the caribou herd between Alaska and Yukon. Yukon, doesn't agree with the way that Alaska does it. Alaska doesn't agree with the way Yukon does it. But there is a body that's created to help mitigate or mediate those issues. And so, we've seen this happen in the past where there's a lot of animosity, but at the same time, when you bring those people together to talk through those problems, they tend to come up with a solution. And so that's really what we've been advocating for and pushing for.
Great, thanks. We have another question in the chat, so I can read it out. It's from Hannah. She says, the Arctic is a critical region in terms of politics, economics, security, and the environment. Other nations, particularly Russia, also have great interest in the region. How can the U.S. strengthen its policies regarding the Arctic?
Yeah, that's something we've been asking for quite a while now. I think, with the way that Russia's advanced their infrastructure development in the north, and not only just their transportation corridor that they've created, the U.S. is kind of looking over there saying, oh, what are we doing? Not really doing much. So we've been arguing about that. I know the U.S. just recently got funding for icebreakers. And again, that's another area where that collaboration between Seattle and Alaska is important, because the icebreakers are actually birthed here in Seattle. And so there's, going to be more work to try and promote the development of those. And just, having a deep water port in Alaska, there isn't one currently. And so, how we do our work geopolitically in Alaska is very important. And it's been, I wouldn't say that, they just haven't been very active in having forward bases there for doing research and that kind of thing. And so that's something that we've been advocating for to push really hard on. The other point on this too that I'll raise is that I know that there's been at least some legislators in Alaska have pushed for how they can do better collaboration between Russia and the U.S. on the Bering Strait passage, and just sharing data of vessels that are transiting that choke point, so that there's just a better awareness on environmental issues that could be going on there. And so that's something that we've also been advocating for. But yeah, it's a real challenge that we see as far as the U.S. trying to, they want to be a partner in the Arctic, but at the same time, they've just now started putting that investment in, where Russia has been doing this for many, many years.
Thank you. Other questions from anybody else? Let's see. I'm trying to think if I had written down a couple, and I know you've already answered some of them. I guess, what do you see as kind of again, the COVID crisis has changed everything, but what do you see going forward as some of the more critical issues that PNWER will address in our region? You know, these students that we have on this call, they're part of our exchange program between British Columbia and Washington. So, you know, while the connections with the Arctic are important, and we're, you know, really invested in this whole side and north part of the country, you know, at the same time, we're looking kind of hyper locally on this exchange. So I'm curious what, from your perspective, you see as some of the really pressing and up and coming issues that affect us really specifically in this region.
Yeah, I think reinstituting trade is going to be the biggest thing. How we can get our borders, you know, flowing more, and getting, you know, I guess we would say non-essential travel instituted, so that there's just that exchange that's going on. I think that's going to be the biggest thing that we have to look at in the next few months here. I know that that's not going to be feasible until we can come up with, you know, better testing and better awareness of what's going on. And so that's another piece of it too. In the next couple of years, or next couple of weeks, I know that we've been compiling a lot of best practices on what has worked well to reopen the economy. And so we're looking at you know, how we can get that information out. I know we do a bi-weekly call with some of our major employers here in the Seattle region, and some of them are instituting some of the best practices that they did when they reopened some of their companies in Shanghai and in China. And so you're trying to just bring out more awareness on that. I think the biggest challenge is going to be, you know, getting the personal protective equipment and the social distancing and those types of things instituted into businesses and into restaurants and theaters and that kind of thing. You know, it's something that it came up. I know with some of our Alaska partners, there's a restaurant up there that said that, you know, it cost me $1 million to reopen this restaurant, and if I do reopen it, how can I guarantee that my employees are going to be safe? How am I going to guarantee that my customers are going to be safe? And so, you know, without eliminating some of that risk, you know, the restaurant owners can't just, you know, put a lot of capital up to reopen again. And so, you know, if they do, then they run the risk of, you know, losing all that investment to reopen, to close just again, to reopen again. And so those are going to be some of the challenges we're going to face over the next few months here. You know, how do we do a reopen the economy that it's not going to, you know, totally eliminate all the risk, of course, but, you know, at least get it to a point where it's somewhat safe for our businesses and companies to come back again.
Great, thank you. If we don't have any other questions, anybody else? Then I think we can thank Steve, and we can move on to Laurie's presentation, but we could also take a minute or two for folks to, again, run to the bathroom if they need to, grab a drink, grab a snack if you need to. I know this is a long stretch, but I really appreciate you taking the time, Steve. I think this is really interesting stuff. It's really cool to think about the different ways that we in our region are working to advocate for our region and investing resources in policy and federal policy as well. And I think that this is really good information for our students to have in their minds as they're doing their exchanges and looking at, you know, ways that our cities and our province and state are connected. So thank you.
Oh no, thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Steve.